from farm, let me tell you specifically about the two programs that are most relevant for this topic today. So AgriWatch is our civic oversight tool through freedom of information requests, parliamentary committee participation, and legislative tracking. We monitor how public money is spent on agriculture at both national and the EU level. So some of what we've encountered: Poland paid over 17 billion zloty in direct support to animal agriculture sector between 2020 and 2024. We flagged significant delays in the implementation of the EU antibiotic regulation, Regulation 2019/6, which is meant to restrict preventive antibiotic use in animal agriculture. And in 2025, we filed a formal complaint to the EU Ombudsperson against the European Commission for abandoning the Sustainable Food System Law, which legislation that had been developed through a consultation with over 2,600 participants. Then we've got Free from Farm. It's our impact mapping program. It maps EU subsidy flows, analyzes their coherence, or rather incoherence in this case, with the EU Green Deal commitments, and builds the evidence base for policy reform towards these plant-based protein systems. And the core finding is very stark. Money follows factory farming, not public health, not climate goals, not consumer rights. So this is just to keep in mind. Then going further, now let's talk about the CAP itself. So the CAP is Europe's largest spending program with a budget of approximately 387 billion for 2023 to 2027. It is the single biggest level for food system transformation. If you want to change food system in Europe, you cannot avoid the CAP. It operates through two main pillars. So the first pillar is direct payments, accounts for around 70% of the CAP budget. It provides income support paid per hectare. In practice, this means that larger farms and particularly large intensive animal agriculture operations receive the most money. It is structurally biased towards scale, not sustainability. And the second pillar, rural development, the remaining 30% is co-founded with member states and is meant to support agri-environmental schemes, organic farming, and rural infrastructure. In theory, it's more targeted. In practice, it's often poorly designed and insufficiently ambitious. But at this, and this is a very crucial part, the CAP is not the only source of public money flowing into agriculture. Our AgriWatch and Free from Farm work maps a much broader landscape. So we've got the EU structural funds, we've got the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, national subsidies for meat and dairy promotions, biogas, biomethane, infrastructure grants, Horizon Europe, Erasmus Plus, and so on and so on. When you look at the full picture, the concentration of public support towards high emission, resource intensive animal-based production becomes even more striking. And let me show you what this looks like in practice with Poland as a case study. Using a freedom of information request, we obtained data from the Polish Ministry of Agriculture and Rural Development. What you see on this slide is what they were able or maybe willing to provide. And already, even with incomplete data, the picture is telling very much. 17 billion zloty, Polish zloty, went to animal production in just 4 years between 2024 and 2024. The largest category by far, direct payments, direct supports tied to the number of animals. But there's a transparency problem when we ask for a full breakdown for how much goes to plant crops for human food versus feed crops for animals. The ministry could not answer. They simply don't collect that data. And plant-based crop support is not separated into food crops versus feed crops in the official reporting system. So this is absolutely not an accident. When data is not collected, accountability is impossible. Citizens cannot know how much of their money goes to subsidizing meat and dairy versus, for example, lentils. And that opacity is itself a form of power. So when we look at individual beneficiaries through open subsidy database in Poland and elsewhere, the picture became even sharper. A small number, very small number of very large producers and international corporations were capturing support across multiple programs at the same time. So why does this matter? Why do we call this a justice gap as Greenref Institute? Well, let me walk you through different dimensions of the problem. So first, there's a concentration of wealth. A first pillar pays per hectare. Large industrial farms receive the most. Small farmers and local producers, the one who could support sustainable local food systems, are marginalized. And the CAP was originally designed to support farming communities. In practice, it has become a mechanism that concentrates wealth in the hands of large agro-businesses. The second thing is the plant protein gap. The EU has talked extensively about protein autonomy, reducing dependence on imported soya, but there is virtually no dedicated support for domestic legume and plant protein production intended for human consumption, because we're talking about human consumption here. Feed crops and food crops are not even distinguished in subsidy data. The result, subsidies undermine the very food sovereignty goals that the EU claims to have and to pursue. Then we got the third aspect, which is opacity of spending, as I described with Polish Ministry of Agriculture, when they cannot even tell how much money goes to animal versus plant production. Something is fundamentally wrong with the accountability framework. This is not a technical data problem. This is a political choice not to know. And the fourth aspect is public health cost. Even every euro that subsidizes intensive animal agriculture is also indirectly a euro or Polish zloty or whatever, subsidizing antibiotic resistance, disease risk, and diet-related illnesses. Over 30% of cancer are linked to diet as of today. The healthcare crisis in Europe, aging population, post-COVID diagnostic backlogs, overstretched public system. This cannot be solved while we, at the same time, pour public money into producing food that drives disease and all the crises. And these costs are borne by citizens and, of course, public health system, not by industry that profits. And going further, let me make this concrete with four case studies from our work. So first is antibiotic resistance. The EU regulation 2019/6 restricts preventive antibiotic use in animal agriculture, and Poland has not yet implemented it. Meanwhile, public subsidies continue to flow to the very sector, to this sector whose practices are accelerating one of the greatest public health threats of this century. We keep raising this, we keep getting passed between ministries. The regulation travels from desk to desk, while antibiotic travel from farm to people on our plates. Case number two is the European Bank for the Reconstruction and Development Fast Food Investment in 2025. Greenref Institute, with a coalition of 75 NGOs, opposing a planned investment of over 40 million in the expansion of Burger King and Popeyes across Central and Eastern Europe. The European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, a public institution, which is a public institution, this is worth to understand, was about to use public money to expand fast food chains dependent on factory farms. We opposed it publicly, and the investment was cancelled. And this is a proof that watchdog action works very, very much when you mobilize, when we mobilize. And there is a case number 3, so it's a complaint to the EU ombudsperson. The Sustainable Food System Law was one of the most ambitious legislative proposal in the EU food policy in decades, developed after a consultation with over nearly 3,000 participants, citizens of the European Union, NGOs, businesses, experts, and so on. The European Commission quietly dropped it. In 2025, we filed a formal complaint to the EU Ombudsperson. The Ombudsperson called on the Commission to provide explanation, and this legislation would have created, for the first time, accountability for, among others, of course, retailers, large producers, and member states within the food system. Its abandonment was not, again, technical decision, it was a political one. And the case 4 is Stop Biomethane. Rush coalition. We are, as Green Ref Institute, we're part of a growing coalition opposition to opposing the blind expansion of biomethane subsidies. And these installations are presented as green energy solutions, but they encourage more intensive animal agriculture. This is greenwashing at scale. We're looking in, we're locking in high emission agriculture under the label of climate transition. So what do we call for? So of course, a national food safety strategy. Poland does not have one. We need a cross-sectoral legal framework that grants food access with a human rights rooted in the constitutional law, EU law, and UN SDGs. Then there's a reform, cap spending priorities, which is redirecting funds towards plant-based protein production for human consumption, short supply chains, and local food systems. Then number 3, full subsidy transparency, a mandatory public registry of all agricultural and environmental subsidy beneficiaries, including indirect support via feed crops and insurance. Then number 4, there's a EU antibiotic regulation immediately. Delayed implementation of regulation is not just a policy failure, it is a violation of the EU law. And then number 5, we've got health impact assessment for agricultural investments. All public funded agricultural investments at national and local level should be subjected to mandatory impact assessment. We cannot keep finding investments whose health costs where we refuse to measure. The 6th one is restrict biomethane subsidies, and the 7th one is the strengthened civic oversight. Watchdog organizations must have a right to participate in consultation and monitoring of public funded programs. Civil society is not a stakeholder to be tolerated. It is an essential accountability mechanism. Thank you so much. And Sabine, I know that you have raised your hands, so I'll stop sharing and stop talk.